Está lá fora aqui no cantinho. Have you any news from ACSM from Christine?
No, I sent a message today, and I haven't heard back from her. I know she's got a lot of things going on right now, so I didn't want to push it too much because she said she wanted to present these memoranda of understanding to some people. So I just don't know what's happening right now. But
I did send an email for her last Saturday about the manifesto, but I didn't get any reply either. In generally speaking, do you use call for action or call to action?
Call to action. So I have actually some of my slides I'm going to go through very quickly because if I spend too much time, then I don't have enough time to do everything. But some of them I'm just going to show the concept and go right away.
Okay. Yes, I realize you have sent too many slides.
I know, but I've done this talk before, and I've done it in 45 minutes for the same reason that I don't spend a lot of time on the slide. I give the concept and go on.
Okay. But remember that in Brazil, the people really is accustomed to. It's not, like I mentioned, the lives in Brazil are not a class, It's not really a classical class. It's more a conversation than a class.
Okay. So will they understand typologia?
Typologia, yeah. I have to talk with the translator about the colotyping because probably we go to disrupt her neurons.
So you better talk to her beforehand because that's one of my first.
Yeah. Let me talk.
Você fala com a Maria, você fala daquilo lá no mesmo, ela vai escutando. Não, chave. Não, ela vai estar escutando você. Ela sempre vai estar escutando. Tá. Ela só vai te responder, só se você pedir para ela te responder.
Tá. Cida, eu preciso falar com você uma coisa. Ele vai falar no começo umas histórias, tá? E uma delas é muito gozada. Ele vai falar de culotipologia. Culo é do espanhol, culo, né? De bunda, tá? Então não esqueça que você vai ter que falar, vai conseguir fazer uma tradução mágica para o português de falar nadegalogia, bundologia, como você quiser, tá? Não vai esquecer que é colotyping. Quando ele falar colotyping, você vai ter que, já estou dando a dica para você não estranhar. Que é uma brincadeira que a gente faz com a ciência, entendeu? A ciência de estudar as bundas, porque ele acha que no Brasil o pessoal é fixado em bunda, tá?
Dr. Victor, prefere nadegologia ou bundologia?
Espera aí, deixa eu escutar a minha assessoria aqui. Pergunta para a Flávia.
Flávia, você acha melhor bundologia ou nadegologia?
Qual o quê?
Você prefere o termo bundologia ou nadegologia? Nadegologia é melhor.
Fala, bolo.
Nadegologia. Nadegologia.
Tá bom, Maria, nadegologia.
Combinado.
Falou. Tá começando, gente. Falta um minuto. Pedro, falta um minuto.
Já tá no ar. Não, vocês.
Maria, nós vamos começar em um minuto. We're gonna start in 1 minute. Tim.
Maria, muta o Zoom e agora é só pelo Meet.
Maria, muta o Zoom e agora é só pelo Meet, tá bom?
Ok.
Que horas são? Que horas são? Não sei que hora. Tá vendo no relógio? Não tem cronômetro aqui.
Let's go.
Pode começar? Muito boa noite. Nós temos hoje uma live fantástica do Selafisques, nessa série de lives que nós fazemos com vocês às quartas-feiras, pois hoje nós temos um convidado do exterior, o Dr. James Skinner, que é longa data, é amigo do Selafisques, já esteve em 5 simpósios anteriormente e vai estar conosco no próximo simpósio, de 1 a 3 de outubro, como todos vocês sabem. O Dr. James Skinner já foi presidente do American College, ele já foi vice-presidente do Conselho Internacional de Ciências do Esporte e Educação Física, é autor de mais de 300 trabalhos, tem uma experiência internacional fantástica, consegue falar 6, 7 idiomas, então é uma pessoa que é do mundo. Com ele eu já viajei pelo mundo afora, nos encontramos em muitas ocasiões e acabamos criando, além de uma relação profissional, uma amizade pessoal extremamente forte. Vocês vão desculpar que daqui para frente eu vou falar em inglês com ele, mas a nossa tradutora, Maria Aparecida, vai estar fazendo a tradução para vocês, de maneira que vocês vão poder entender perfeitamente a live desta noite feita com o Dr. James Skinner. Lembrando que o simpósio, então, é de 1 a 3 de outubro e que os temas livres estão abertos até o dia 15 de setembro, com 5 prêmios oferecidos aí para o pessoal da área de nutrição, da área de exercício, na área de atividade física, na área de performance e na área de treinamento. Então, vocês podem se inscrever, mandando seus temas livres até o dia 15 de setembro. Tim, we are very honored to have you with us tonight. I was trying to share with them our long relationship and friendship, and we are very pleased that you accept to be part of this live from Celas Physics tonight. And welcome to our live, and we are very hungry to get some ideas from you, particularly because we have developed not only a professional relationship, but a personal relationship. And probably, if you like, you can comment about this professional and particularly personal relationships.
Okay. So, boa noite para todos os meus amigos e colegas no Brasil. Tenho o prazer de falar com vocês mais uma vez, mesmo que eu prefira estar em São Paulo para apresentar essa palestra. Já estive no Selafisques Simpósio muitas vezes e sempre gostei do meu tempo com todos vocês, especialmente as lindas brasileiras. Espero poder voltar depois que a pandemia acabar. Now, I will speak in English. I hope you understood what little Portuguese I know. As Victor has said, I have known Victor for many years, and I have seen him in many parts of the world. I was with him when he met Sandra She picked him over me for some reason I don't understand, but I've known him and I've known Flavia and his family, so we've been a very close relationship. I've always had a good time in Sao Paulo. The people there treated me very nicely. I remember one Congress where Victor did not have a great deal of money, so he had 3 speakers to speak in Spanish, so he did not have to have a translator. I was just learning Spanish at that point. My Spanish was not that strong, so I had to read and speak slowly. The other 2 speakers, one was from Cuba and spoke with a very strong Cuban accent and spoke very rapidly. The other one was from Barcelona and had a very strong Catalonian accent. After our talks, many people came up and said I was the only one they understood because I had to speak slowly. After that,
that's a good story.
After that particular Congress, Victor and I and the person from Cuba went to San Sebastião, to his cabin, his cottage, and to Ilha Bela. And as we were walking along the beaches, we saw all the beautiful brasileiras in Tongas. So Victor and I had the idea to start a new science, which was culotypologia, because some of the culos of the brasileiras were mesomorphic. They're more muscular. Some were rounder, more endomorphic, and some were lean, more ectomorphic. And then we had a psychologist friend that said some were more depressed and some were more gay. Anyway, we started to start this science, but we could not continue because Victor wanted to use a hands-on approach to collect all the data.
Not true, it's not true.
And many subjects did not agree. So we could not get enough subjects because Victor wanted to handle all of the data.
That's not true.
That gives you an idea.
Terrible guy.
That's the relationship that I've had with this man for many, many years. So I think now I will start my talk. And if you have any questions along the way, we will stop and have a conversation about it. Okay?
Okay, perfect.
All right.
Let's start.
So I'm going to be talking about genetics, and I want to make sure that people understand I am not a geneticist, but I have worked with people who know a great deal about genetics. And what I try to do is to explain how this information is gathered. I was involved with a major study for 12 years, $40 million, looking at genetics and response to training. And so I want to explain to you what we found. First, I want to talk a little bit to give some definition. The first is genotype, which is your basic combination of genes. In other words, that's your genetic background. The phenotype is how your genetic background is expressed. So you have brown hair, you're 1.7 meters tall, you have a maximal oxygen intake or fitness level at a certain point, your blood pressure is 120/80, that sort of thing.
Are you changing slides?
Huh? I'm changing. Can you see the new slide?
No, because we are getting the same slide, Jim.
Well, I'm changing it here. Okay, I don't know. Then okay, then we're going to have to. I'm changing it here, but it's not changing on where
okay.
you get it.
Okay, I'm going to change for you.
Okay.
Você tem que me abrir aqui. Gente, você tem que me abrir.
Quando a internet dele tá lenta. Porque ele pediu para passar. Tem que liberar.
Jim, we are checking.
Okay.
It's just a problem in your computer because perhaps your internet is a little bit working like a Brazilian style, very slow.
but it's not.
But we'll go to share your presentation through myself.
Okay. So then I have to tell you when to move. Okay. Okay, go up. You're too far.
Yeah.
Go back to number 2.
Mas é 2 slides para trás. Esse aqui é o segundo. Isso, mais para trás, mais para trás, mais para trás. Esse aí. Tentamos share screen. Tentamos share screen. Tá? Mais uma vez.
Okay. Can you make that larger? Yeah, there we go. All right. So what I said before was just that your genotype is your basic genetic background and how your genes are combined in your body, and the phenotype is how they're expressed. So your color of your hair, your eyes, how tall you are, what your blood pressure is, your heart rate, that sort of thing. Next slide. Now, genetic influences tend to be stronger than structural components, but function is more affected by environment. So, for example, I'll give you some examples in the next slide. So if we take just how tall you are, linear measurements, the length of your bones and your legs, your arms, your trunk, that's a very high genetic effect because it's structure. Whereas the circumference, for example, the circumference of a muscle depends if I lift weights. Circumference of my waist depends on whether I eat a lot or I go on a diet and lose that. So the environment will affect that much more. So the genetic effect is not as good. Next slide. Same thing with muscle. The size and the composition of the fibers of the muscle and the strength is more related to structure, and therefore the genetic effect is high. But muscular endurance is moderate to high because I've also got to do the training, and by training I improve the enzymes and the density of the mitochondria that provides energy, and that's more affected by environment, or in this case training. So the structural effect is very high, the size of the muscle, but the function of the muscle is more a matter of training or other environmental factors. Next one. Same thing with your lungs. How the size of your lungs, the volume is more or less related to your body size and your structure, but the function is less of a genetic effect, because if you smoke or if you have asthma, then the environment is affecting you more. The genetic effect would be less. Next. Same thing in the heart. The size of the heart and the resting heart rate, this is all related to the size, and that's a structure, so it's very high. But when I talk to blood pressure, it's not as high because I can be nervous, I can have a diet with a lot of salt, I can do other things that will affect the function of the heart and of the body, and therefore it has less of a genetic effect and more of an environmental effect. Next slide. That just gives you some ideas. Now, there are 2 types of genetic effects. The first one is how people are right now. And the second one is how they respond to a stimulus. So how am I right now? I'm a certain weight. If I go on a diet, then I start with where I am now, but also some people will respond better than others. And so there are two types of genetic effects. And I'll be using these two terms many times. One is, how are you now? And how do you respond to a change in your environment? Next. So what you see here is that your genotype or your genetic background will affect your physical activity. It also affects how fit you are and how healthy you are. So we know that we have the genetic effects on all three of those, but we also know that physical activity will affect how fit you are. Your fitness level will affect how active you are. How active you are relates to your health, and how healthy you are relates to your activity. So they're all interrelated. So you see on those yellow lines the effect of genetics on that, as well as the effect of each of these phenotypes, which in this case is how much exercise will affect your fitness, or how much fitness will affect your activity. Okay? So there are high, average, and low responders. There are people who respond very well to diet. Some people will lose weight very quickly with diet, and others will not. Some people will take exercise and train, and some will improve a great deal, and some not at all. But in terms of medication, a person may go to a doctor's office and say, I have high blood pressure. And the doctor says, okay, take 10 milligrams of this medication. He gets the effect. The next person comes in, he has to give him 20 milligrams to get the same effect. Therefore, his response is different, and genetics may affect that. Third person comes in, and the doctor tries the first medication. It doesn't work. He has to go to another medication. So genetics will affect how you respond, and the genetics will affect how fast you respond and how much you respond. So here we have a situation where, how are you now? How is your blood pressure now? How is it after you take medication or after you lose weight and that sort of thing? And so it's the two genetic effects, how you are now and how you respond. Next. Now, these are two identical twins. They don't look like identical twins, but they are, because that's been shown. And they were in Germany, and one of them decided to be a 10-kilometer runner, and the other decided to be a wrestler. I think it's obvious which one is which. Next slide. And you can see the difference in their body structure. The wrestler has much bigger bones, bigger muscles, and he's much stronger, whereas the distance runner has better endurance. He's thinner. Now, these two were fairly good athletes at the local and regional level, but they were not very good at the national level and never made it to the international level. So think of this, the genetic effect here. They start in the middle. So let's say they start here, because they are identical. So they started out pretty much the same. The one person decided to be a wrestler could only go so far, because he didn't start over here. He started here, and he got just so far. The other one wanted to be a distance runner, can only go so far. So they couldn't go too far away from where they were, because their genetics is affecting where they started. So that's why they never became good at the international level, but they were good at the regional level. So they start out the same, and the next slide, yeah. There are people who are genetically more fit but less active, and there are people who are genetically less fit but more active. So they may have the same fitness level, the same strength level, but they're not the same. You can't predict how active a person is from how fit they are. You can't predict how fit a person is from how active they are. Next slide. So what you see is, if you have identical twins, an identical twin is identical. He has the same genetic background, but he's the same person in duplicate. So if you have two identical twins who would have the same or similar levels of activity, they will tend to have the same fitness level, and they will tend to adapt in the same way to training. Now, you can have non-identical twins, and they are genetically like two brothers or two sisters, or a brother and a sister. They're very similar, but they're not identical genetic background. Now, if you take two brothers who are not identical twins, and they have a similar level of activity, they will vary much more in their fitness level and vary much more in how they adapt to training. So genetics will affect where you start and how you respond. You see in the next slide, this is studies of aerobic ability in identical twins. And what you see, look on the left-hand side, this is the Vo2 Max, or the fitness level after training. And you see in the very lower left-hand corner, you have one set of, this is one twin on the lower part, and you have another twin here. And if you see that you have one set of twins right in the lower left-hand corner where neither twin improved in their fitness level. Then you go all the way up on the line, and what you see is that there's some twins, one twin improved a lot, and so did the other. So that how they are, how they start, and how they respond is quite similar. So that some people don't respond well at all, some respond much better, and some respond in an average way. Next slide. And you see the same thing. This is resemblance between identical twins for how much they improve their strength after 10 weeks of strength training. And what you see, if you look at that line of identity, which says that if one person improves 10%, the other one improved 10%, and you see that they're very similar. There's some variation, but it's very similar. If one twin increases their strength quite a bit, so does the other. And if one twin doesn't improve much, neither does the other. So genetics plays a role in how much people can improve relative to training. There's studies showing that they, in terms of diet and how they will gain weight or lose weight, and also in terms of medication. Next slide. Now, we did a study, and I had 29 undergraduate students, and we trained them for 16 weeks. Actually, it was closer to about 14 weeks. And you can see the variation in response. We had some people on the lower, at the left-hand side, they're very what we call low responders, average responders in the middle, and high responders on the right-hand side. So what we did was we said, we had 27 or 29 subjects. Let's take the 9 people with the lowest improvement in training, and we call them low responders, and compare them to the 9 high responders. Next slide. And what you see here are the high responders. Victor, let me ask you a question. When I put my pointer, do you see the pointer on your screen or not?
No.
Okay, that's what I was afraid of. Okay, so what you have here at the left-hand side is we tested them before training, and you see it varied to about 52 ml per Vo2 Max of oxygen consumption of 35 to 50 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight each minute. 45 is a typical value for an untrained college male. So they started out more or less average. And we tested them every 4 weeks for 12 weeks of training. And what you see is they all had fairly good responses. So at the end of the 12 weeks, they averaged an increase of about 8 or 9 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. Then they went home for 4 weeks over Christmas. And when they came back, we said, we want to train you a different way. Would you be willing to do that again? And 4 said yes. Now you notice over the 4 weeks at home where they sat around and ate a lot and probably didn't exercise, most of them returned basically to the level they started. And then we trained them a different way. And you see, again, after 12 weeks of training, they all improved about the same amount as before. So these were high responders. Next slide. Now we also had 9 low responders, and you see they're between 40 and 50. So they were, that's average for untrained college students, males. And we trained them, and you see that they had a very low increase, average of about 3 ml per kilogram. They went home for Christmas, and when we came back, we said to them, would you be willing to train again? And only one said yes. The other said, nothing happened. Why should I come back? But one said, I want to be more fit. So he trained very hard in another way. And again, you see, after another 12 weeks of training, he still did not improve. So we have some people for this type of aerobic training, 2 different types of aerobic training. One was constant and the other was going up and down in an interval training, that you have high responders and low responders. Next slide. So this was one of the studies that was the basis of the Heritage Family Study. This was a study of a large number of people that was supported for 12 years by the National Institutes of Health to look at the genetic basis of response to training and changes in risk factors for heart disease and type 2 diabetes. So we had healthy, sedentary families. The parents were 65 years or younger, because we didn't want to be 80s and 80s, and you got the effective age. The children were 17 to 40, but the 17 was 17 years and 11 months. So he was 18. But we didn't want to get 13 and 14-year-old children because they're maturing, going through adolescence at that period of time, and any changes in them might be more affected by how much weight they gained during that period of time. So we had essentially a young and middle-aged adults. We started out, back up. We started out with about 800 people. We wound up with 750, 500 whites and about 250 blacks from these families. Next slide. Now, as I told you, this was a genetic study, but the fact is we had, as you can see on the upper right-hand corner, almost 300 males and 350 females. We had at the lower, about 200 blacks and 435 whites for a total of 633. That's 633 of the 750 that we knew we had really good data in terms of their fitness level after testing before and after. So we even though it was a genetic study, we could also look at differences between blacks and whites, and we could look at difference between males and females. In addition, we also had people 17 to 29. You can see 315 of those. We had 30 to 49. We had 200, and 50 to 65. We had 118. So we could also compare the effect of aging. So even though it was a genetic study, we had enough numbers that we could also look and say, what's the effect of age, race, and gender? Next slide. So what we did was we trained them for 20 weeks, and they had to come 3 times a week for 20 weeks, so that they did they were supposed to do 60 sessions, and they were never allowed to miss more than 2 sessions in a week. They always had to be within 1 or 2 sessions of where they were supposed to be as we went along, or we dropped them from the study because we didn't want to say, well, these people improved more than these people, but they came more often than these. So if they didn't keep coming when they were supposed to, we dropped them from the study. So we had mother, father, and at least 2 children, because we were looking at genetics. If we didn't have the parents, we were just studying children. If we just had the mother And we needed to have the mother and the father so we could look and see the effect on the children. And what you see is what we did. We started out at a moderate intensity for 30 minutes, and then every 2 weeks, we increased either the intensity or the duration until in the last 6 to 8 weeks, they were working at 75% Vo2 max for about 45 to 50 minutes, a very good program. This was supervised on a bicycle ergometer and supervised and monitored by a computer that kept them at the heart rate associated where they were supposed to be for the entire time by increasing or decreasing the resistance to maintain the heart rate within 1 or 2 beats of where it was supposed to be at all times. Next slide. So, you want to take a break now, Victor, for a second, see if there are any questions?
No, Joe, I'm quite curious to see the results in terms of a comparison between the Afro-Americans and the Caucasians. Okay. If I don't know if you have the data, but...
Yeah, we have the data.
Okay.
Okay. I just wanted to, I'm going to get into results now, and I wonder if anyone had any questions, we could do it now about the study or genetics.
Yeah, no.
Okay. All right. So the first question we asked was, do families start out with a similar Vo2 max or other things like blood pressure, and are they similar when they start out? So in other words, how are they now? Is there a genetic effect of within the family that the families are very similar? Next slide. So what you see here are some bars, and each one of those bars you see there, the top and the bottom is the highest and lowest person in that one family, and you see points along the way, and those are the points for each of those members of that family, and it's the average. The line that goes up there is the average for that family. So you could see on the left-hand side, there were some families where everyone was below the average of that red line, and some were right on the average, and some were started out slightly above average. So in this case, it turned out that about 41% of the variation in how people started out was related to genetics, to their family. So we had some families where everyone was more fit and some where they weren't, but there was a big variation. Next slide. And you could see we had 4 centers that were collecting data, and you could see, look at the variation, just like I showed you in one of the earlier slides. Look at the variation across these points. We're on the left-hand side, you see, let's say at Indiana, you see that right where he's pointing, there's some people who did not improve at all, and there were some who improved quite a bit. And the same thing is true in if you look at all 4 centers, Minnesota, Texas, and Quebec, there were some people who did not improve at all in all 4 centers, and there were some who improved a great deal. The average improvement in Vo2 max, or fitness level, was 19%, which is very typical of what you find. But it varied from 0% to 50%. Now, a lot of times, if you're looking at research studies, they'll just tell you the average, but they don't tell you the variation in the response. So all 4 centers had about 19 to 20% improvement, but it varied from 0 to 50, 0 to 40 and all percent in just about every case. So there's a lot of variation. Next slide. Victor, next slide. Is it not working?
Can you see?
Okay. So here you see is a distribution of changes. And we only had about 700 people here, 650 people or so. And so you can see it's not complete, but you can see that there's some people down at plus or minus 2 ml per kilogram. Those would be considered basically non-responders. Then you have some people who are up very high, and they are high responders, but most people are sort of average. And so you see this bell-shaped curve that you would normally see. And I think if we probably had 2,000 or 3,000 people, this probably would smooth out and you would get this distribution where you had a few people at either end and the majority of people in the middle. But you can see that there are high and low responders. Yeah, next slide. Now, this next slide is a study done in Finland in which they had people do two types of training. One did moderate volume, and the other one did high volume of training. And you see that regardless of whether you're doing just a moderate amount or a high amount of training, that there were high and low and average responders with both types of training. Now, interesting, the average response was about 11% improvement. Now, I'm going to show you later on, but you'll see the same thing here. Look at the baseline with the response. The correlation between where you start and where you finish was 0.004, which says there's no relationship between where you start and where you finish. And I'll discuss that a little bit more later on. Next slide. And this slide shows the individual patterns of adaptation to 1 year of training and another study. And what you see, wherever you see it's white, that meant that they improved. If when it's black, there was no improvement. And where it's shadow, where there has the diagonal lines, it's not really sure. So it looks like the eight people improved in everything of these 4 variables that they were looking at. 10 subjects, they had 1 or 2 things that did not improve, but at least 1 variable improved in each subject. So you get a lot of variation if you look at the more variables you look at, the more variation you see in how people respond. And I've got a very nice slide later that shows you more about what it is for the heritage study and how our people responded. Next slide. So this is looking at the difference between men and women. So what we have here are the females are green, the males are yellow, and the heritage study only went up to about 65, but you notice that there's some others that are going up to about 73. Well, Wendy Court, who was one of my doctoral students, did another study looking at people between the ages of about 55 and 73, and she found similar data, so I just put it all in one slide. And what you see is, across age, there's no difference in how well people respond, and there's no difference between males and females. So at any age, you see that there are high, average, and low responders in both males and females. So age had no effect, and whether you were male or female had really no effect, and that there's no difference in how much people improve their fitness level. The same thing is true with blacks and whites. Now, if you do it this way, you see that there are high, average, and low responders between blacks and whites at all ages. And I'm sure if we had a large group of Hispanics, or we had a large group of Asians, we would have probably found a similar type of thing, that you've got high, average, and low responders in most different populations. Okay. Next slide. So that was how some of the changes. Then the second question we asked was, do families respond similarly to training? So the next slide shows the same thing again. There's much more variation, but each one of those rectangles has the average of each person in the family. And again, you see there's some families where on the lower left-hand side where everybody is a low or non-responder. And on the right-hand side, you see there's some where everyone in the family is a high responder, with all variations in between. So it turns out that about 47% of how much you change is related to genetics, or to what family you started in. Now, it's not the same families that started high or low that had high or low responses, because remember, there's no correlation between where you start and where you finish. Next slide. A third question was, I mentioned already, what's the relationship between initial values and the response? What's the relation between where you are, now and how you respond. And with the 633 people from the Heritage study, the correlation was 0.08. So at all ages, at all baseline, this is the baseline on the bottom, and the change on the side, you see the correlation is 0.08. People who started out with very low levels, you have high and low responders. People who started with average levels of fitness had high and low responders, and a few of the people who had high values were high and low responders. So where you are now, if you start the training, is not going to be related. And the question then is, why is that the case? Well, the reason is because different genes are involved in how you are now, and different genes are involved in how you respond. So they're not the same genes, and so there's not a correlation. Next slide. I'm going to go through these next 3 or 4 fairly quickly. This is the average response in Vo2 Max, putting all people together. And you see again, of all 4 centers, you see the correlation. There's 0.01, and that for this particular one. There's no relative. There's a big variation. Next slide. If you take people in the lower who started at the lower half or the upper half, again, you see a lot of variation between how people respond. It has nothing to do whether they start with low values or high values. Next slide. This is heart rate at 50 watts. Normally, when you become better trained, your heart rate at 50 watts will go down. And you saw for most people, it was pretty much that way. Next slide. But if you start out with the people who started out with less than 119, you still see a lot of variation in response. The people who had more than 119 beats per minute, you still have a large variation in response. Next slide is the blood pressure response at 50 watts. And again, with training, the blood pressure, systolic blood pressure will tend to go down. You see that there's a lot of variation in how they responded. Next slide. And if you split them into 2, next slide, Victor. You see the same thing, that whether the people who started with lower baseline blood pressures at 50 watts, there's still a lot of variation in their response, and the people who had higher values, the same thing. Next slide.
Jim.
Yeah.
May I ask a question that people are asking me? It's generally we expect that blood pressure decline with training, and how to explain that these people, most of them, got an increase in blood pressure with training?
Well, if you go back to the previous slide, the mean response is that it did go down 8 millimeters of mercury. And that's what happens when you report data and you only report the average. On the average, it did. But there are a few people who don't respond as well. I'm going to talk about that later. But for the group, there was an improvement. Okay.
Sure.
But now remember, these were healthy people. These were not people who had high blood pressure to begin with. These were all people with normal blood pressure.
Yeah.
Okay. But on the average, it did. But a few people stayed about the same. Right about where that crossover. A lot of that crossover area, it just sort of essentially no difference. But if the blood pressure is normal, you don't need to change it. So, but if you go to the next slide, what you see is on the right-hand side, those people who started out with higher values tend to have more of a decrease than the people who started out with low values. But you still have some people who don't respond to that program. They're high, average, and low responders.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next slide. And this is HDL cholesterol. On the average, it tends to go up. Not much of a difference. Next slide. The same thing. You split them into people who started with high or low. You still get an increase, but it's not very much. Okay, go next slide. So we also tend to say that if you improve your fitness, you're going to improve your risk factors. And again, if you see data where you got the averages, that's correct. You generally will see a decrease in weight with people who exercise. But the change in your fitness versus compared to the change in your weight, there's no correlation. Or how much fat you have. There's the people who improved their fitness more probably did more exercise and therefore they lost a little more fat. But that's still not very much. Fasting, insulin, cholesterol, triglycerides, blood pressure, no relationship. Why not? Different genes affect triglycerides and blood pressure, and then that's different from the genes that affect your improvement in fitness. So the change in one is not related to a change in the other. On the average, you'll see if your fitness goes up, your blood pressure will go down. But within any level of fitness or any level of blood pressure, they're not related and how much they change. Next slide. Okay, now here, this is we looked at high responders, those who improve more than 80%, and low responders less than 20%, and 7 phenotypes. We looked at Vo2 Max, percent body fat, visceral adipose fat, HDL cholesterol, fasting insulin, LDL cholesterol, and an inflammation marker. And what you see is, if you see that for at least half the people had one or more high and one or more low variations. So they improved in one or more, they were high responders, but low responders in something else. 24% had at least one high and no low, and 24% had at least one low and no high. So you have some people that do, but average, only 2% were average across all variables. So what you've got is that most people will respond in something, but not necessarily in everything. Now you have a few. If you look at this very low part here, where you have how many was a low responder and a high responder. If you look on the left-hand side, if they had 5 low responses and no high responses, you had 4 people who out of that 700, out of 564, you had 4 people who were fairly good low responders in 5 different things and not high in any of them. Similarly, you had 5 people who were high responsive, 4 people who had 5 high responses and no low responses. These would be called good responders. If you look at 6 and 7, let's look at 7. There's some people, there was one person out of 564 who was a low responder in all 7 of those variables. And you had one responder who was a high responder in all 7 variables. Now that's out of 560 something people. You have one or two people who we would call universal high responders or universal low responders. Most people are just a mixture of the two. And so what that means is, if you are trying to convince someone to be active, you can't tell them you're going to get a high response, you're going to improve your weight, your cholesterol, your blood pressure, your fitness, all of these things. You may improve some, but not all. Okay, next one. And we have some people who we would call adverse responders. This going back to your question, Victor, about some people with their blood pressure. And what you see, looking at these 4 things: resting systolic blood pressure, plasma triglycerides, fasting insulin, and HDL cholesterol. And this little red area, those would be the people we said that's an adverse response, that after training, their blood pressure actually went up. That's from the Heritage study. But we were not the only ones. Next slide, you see that there were, for 7 different studies, there were, in each one of these things, there were about 7 or 8% of the population that were in each of those studies that had adverse responses. So there's some people who just don't improve their cholesterol or their blood pressure or their triglycerides. And so that's what we have to have. We know that going in. Go to the next slide, please. So the message is that they're high, average, low, and adverse responses. The responses of one are poorly correlated with another. Risk factors response are independent of change. And so you have all that. Now, but one advantage that training has over medication is that training has multiple effects, whereas medication is generally only one. And medication may have side effects which are not good, whereas the training normally doesn't have so many side effects. Next slide, Victor. Go to the next slide. Next slide. Skip. So the next question we had was, is there any way before training we can say who's going to be a responder and who's going to be a non-responder? Can we find some variable that will help us, or set of variables that will help us predict who's going to respond? Next slide. We have not found any variable or set of variables that can predict who is going to be a responder. You know how you find out who's going to be a responder? You train them and see who responds. You can't do it any other way. Next slide. Are there genetic variables that differentiate between responders and non-responders? Next slide. And what you see here is that early on, there were some studies that looked at the angiotensin converting enzyme, just one gene, and they found some improvements that a particular form of that gene, where the athletes were better off than controls. But if you look at the lower part, where you've got large numbers, what you see in effect is if you pick that one gene, there's no relationship between how the structure of that gene and how people respond. So, and these are larger numbers, and so looking at one gene, you have to remember this was done back in the 90s. The green with the top level, most of those were done in the 90s, where it was only able to do one gene because it was very expensive. Now we can do a whole genome in 1 or 2 days, whereas before it was too difficult. But it's hard. If so many genes are involved, one gene will never be the only factor. Okay, next slide. But we can predict. We have some genes that we're able to look at that and say, okay, if you had 21 different genes, if you, on the lower left-hand side, if you had less than 9 of these, that would be how much you responded and to improve your fitness level, which is fairly low. If you had more than 19, then you got more of an improvement. So you can predict somewhat from genetics. If you have 19 or 20 of these genes, you're going to improve more than if you only have 6 or 7. But it's not completely everything. Next slide. The same thing with response to heart rate at 50 watts. If you have, there were about 18 different ones, and if you had more than 16, you improved a lot. If you had less than 9, you didn't improve very much. So you can predict to some extent from genetics, but it's any of the 19 or any of the 21. It's not a particular one. So we were unable to say this gene is the only one that's affected everybody. Next one. So what are we left up? We're left up your baseline. Your baseline has very little effect. Your age, your sex, your weight, your ethnicity, whether or not you trained. The heritability is about 47%. That's the only one that's there that's worth very much. Your genetics will influence about 47% of your changes. Now, that's not for an individual. That's for a population. So if you've got 10,000 people, it will predict for those 10,000 people. For one person, you never know because there are too many other things involved. Next slide. So you can't predict. If you are a high performer, that's a result of where you started. You started at a high level, you had adequate training, and you were a high responder. So think of it this way. Remember the top 10%, what we call high responders. So if you start in the top 10% and you improve in the top 10%, that's 1% of the total population, and that's why you are a world-class athlete. But you could start low and have a high response and still not be very good. You could start high and have a very low response and still not be adequate. So we can't really predict that well how people are going to respond. Next. phenotypes are very complex, so, and you have many genes, and you have interaction between the genes, among the genes, and between the genes and environment. So it's just too complex. Most of our problems are lifestyle, not genetics. Next slide. Not everyone responds the same way to exercise or any other change. Non-responders are not necessarily non-adherers. Remember in the Heritage study, if they didn't do at least 57 of the 60 sessions, we threw them out. So they all adhered. They all did the program. So there were non-responders, not just because they didn't do the study. So many genes are involved. You may not respond for one phenotype, let's say blood pressure, but you may or may not be a response for another type, and that's your weight loss. Next slide. Go to the next slide. What are the implications for promoting physical activity? Next slide. You can't predict how people are going to respond. You need to emphasize that not everyone can improve their fitness or their weight or their blood pressure. Now, we may eventually get more information as to who has a tendency to be a high average or low responder, but we don't have that information now. Next slide. Low fitness and low inactivity are independent risk factors. Both are related to overall mortality, but fitness is affected more by genetics than your inactivity, because inactivity is a behavior. Therefore, promote activity and lifestyle modification, because you can't change your fitness, so you can't change your genetics. Next slide. Activity and fitness are not the same. The process of being active is more important than the product of being fit. It's being active on a regular basis. That's what's more important. So next slide. So what you want to emphasize is think more about activity and less about fitness, because there's many ways to increase activity to get similar benefits. So find things you like to do and do them regularly and make activity part of your lifestyle. When people say to me, what's the best program of exercise for my health? I would say find things you enjoy and do them. Next slide. But we have a lot to learn, still have a lot much more to learn. Muito obrigado por sua atenção. Okay?
Thank you very much, Jim. It was a marvelous presentation. And we have got some questions, but most of them you have answered progressively in your talk. The most persistent question we got is people asking about the final comments you made in regards to physical activity. As far genetics can explain physical activity. If you have anything more to talk about, very great, because people are not interested.
If you have identical twins, there tends to be more of a similarity between the identical twins than non-identical twins. But remember, activity is behavior. And so there are studies show that if both parents are active, the children tend to be more active. Now, is that genetics or environment? You see? So my parents are active. They made it as part of their lifestyle, as part of my lifestyle. But it's not just one or the other. It's the numbers is really not that good, because genetics is one thing, and there's some studies that say, oh yeah, if you have certain genes that you'll tend to be more active, but you're talking about correlations of about 0.2, 0.3, which means there's maybe something there, but it's not important. Behavior is much more important. That's why I say you stress behavior, because you can't change your genes.
Agree.
Yeah?
It's a very important message, because I think your messaging, when you say that think less about fitness and think more about the physical activity,
yeah,
the main important message for health. Considering health like outcome, I think this phrase is perfect and really help people to get more health behavior when doing something than just lay down on their genetics.
Right. But remember, in the heritage study, we sat down with every person after the study and went over all their results. And we had to tell some people, they say, wait a minute, I trained for 20 weeks. I didn't improve my fitness. I wanted to reduce my blood pressure and I wanted to lose weight. What was I doing? Why did I do this program? Well, you did improve your cholesterol. You did do this. You did do that. We can't predict what's going to happen. You've got to do it and see what happens. Now, what you may wind up doing is you say, okay, you did exercise and I didn't lose any weight. Okay, now you maybe better be doing more diet. Or maybe I didn't change my blood pressure. Okay, maybe now you need to get more medication. But exercise, you still feel better. You're still healthier, but you didn't change what you want. And this is where the personal trainers have a problem. The person says, I want to come in to be fit. I want to come in to lose weight. I want to come in and change this. Well, I can't promise you that. That's why I don't call them fitness centers. I call them health centers or activity centers, because I can guarantee you make you more active. I can probably guarantee you'll be more healthy, but maybe not exactly what you wanted.
Yeah,
I can't guarantee you'll be more fit.
Unless you're an illusion seller.
Yeah. And that's why it's difficult to sell this sometimes, because people say I did it and nothing happened.
Sure.
Something happened, but it wasn't what they wanted to happen.
Oh, quite fascinating topic, and you developed so well, and I'd like to thank you very much, Jim. I'm sorry because time ran out, and of course we have interest to stay longer talking all night long, but we have
one comment to make. Do you remember this woman?
Yes, Catherine Tudorlock.
Katrina Tudorlock.
Yes.
Okay. She was there at the Salafiscus meeting with me. So she said, teach me Portuguese. And so I taught her tudo bom, tudo bem. Then I said, now when people come up to you and say, tudo bom, you say, no, Tudorlock. So at least during that week, there was tudo bom, tudo bem, and Tudorlock.
Yeah, good ending, good story to close our.
Espero que todos vocês permaneçam seguros e saudáveis nestes tempos difíceis e que nos vejamos em breve. Até lá, boa noite.
Boa noite. Muito obrigado, Jim. Foi espetacular. Vocês viram o conhecimento do Jim realmente fora de série. E é somente um daqueles 25 conferencistas internacionais que nós vamos ter aqui no simpósio, cada um deles expressando o seu conhecimento em áreas específicas, como foi hoje à noite o Jim falando com vocês aí de uma das áreas de treinamento esportivo, fisiologia, que é a parte genética. Eu agradeço bastante, Jim. I want to thank you so much for your effort, for your capability, and your attention to our audience. And hopefully we have a chance to see you pretty soon in the symposium, among other 25 international speakers. And for sure you'll be a big star among them. Okay. Thank you very much. Então, gente, muito obrigado, boa noite, e vamos curtir aí, porque o simpósio está chegando, e como eu estava falando, são mais de 25 conferencistas internacionais, todos do padrão do Jim, que vocês vão adorar bastante. Temas livres até o dia 15 de setembro, e prêmios para 5 categorias de temas livres. Um abraço forte, e até a próxima live do Salafiscus. Muito boa noite. Boa noite, Jim.